from violating her husband's consent to setting unrealistic standards of beauty and perfection. Here's the real reason Daphne Bridgerton is a shame to feminists. She forced herself onto Simon. The 6th episode of Shonda Rhimes' Bridgerton was quite intense. There's a reason why this episode sparked so much debate and earned the show its title of being problematic. If you remember correctly, this is the episode in which our little Miss Perfect did something irredeemable and showed the world that she's a terrible character to idolize. Daphne and Simon finally managed to seal the deal and get married. Then they move into the Hastings Manor and are greeted by a literal army of servants. Guess how they chose to spend the first few days of their marriage? That's right, sex, a whole lot of it. So much so that I'd advise you not to watch this show in the living room or with your family. But that's not even the issue here. The real problem starts when the diamond of the season realizes that her husband is hiding something. Simon always seems to pull out before the deed is done. And this is a bit weird for his lady love, though she doesn't question it at the start. But soon enough, the truth comes out. And when Daphne realizes that the man she'd married had been lying to her about his inability to have kids, she decides to take matters into her own hands. She forces herself onto him even though he clearly wanted her to stop. Yikes! Can someone tell Mrs. Hastings that's not the right way to be a girl boss? And that's not even all of it. After assaulting her husband, Daphne Bridgerton shows that she's a classic victim blamer. Ah yes, the age-old trick that the patriarchy has always used to shut survivors up. Just tell them it's their fault, right? That's precisely what we see our so-called feminist icon doing. Even before poor old Simon had the chance to express his hurt, Daphne began to play the victim. She literally told him that he lied to her, even though she trusted him more than anyone in the world. The young bride then went on to accuse him of taking advantage of her and defended her actions by saying that she simply did the same. Wow. Can someone please explain to this girl that hiding the truth from someone is not in the same league as forcing yourself onto another person? What's worse is the show basically refused to address what Daphne had done and focused more on Simon's betrayal instead. In fact, when speaking to The Wrap, Phoebe Dynevor, the actress who plays Daphne, had the audacity to say that her character was a feminist born in the wrong era. Yeah, right. Since when has feminism become about not respecting other people's choices? That's another reason why we really shouldn't glorify Daphne as a Regency-era feminist. She has zero respect for Simon's decisions. Let's face it, guys. If Daphne Bridgerton were a male character, people would have canceled her a long time ago. If the third wave of feminism and the rise of the Me Too movement has taught us anything, it's that we need to be aware of our own double standards. And the most frustrating thing about Daphne is that the showmakers try their hardest to make her seem like an empath when she's really not, especially when it boils down to getting her way with things. And while some people might say that Daphne's stubbornness makes her empowering, it shouldn't come at the expense of her loved ones. But that's exactly what ends up happening in the show. Simon makes it clear that he doesn't want to have kids, time and time again. And yes, sure, he's not fully honest with her, but she knows that being with Simon means she'll have to spend a life without children. Though by the end of season 1, the Hastings welcome a son into their family, all because of Daphne's refusal to accept that her husband has a choice in the matter too. Oh, and might I just remind you that Simon's refusal to have kids was rooted in good reason. He was literally traumatized by his dad and swore never to have children of his own. You can't force someone to overcome their trauma just so you can get what you want, Mrs. Daphne. But then again, a whole lot of people sympathize with her. Say anything you want about this cheesy Regency variation of Gossip Girl, but you can't deny that the show has sparked some interesting debates about themes such as consent, sexuality, race, and gender. There's a reason why over 82 million households watched season 1 of the show worldwide. But even though the show has a lot of viewers, many of them are divided about Daphne's character. Some people expressed their disgust and rage on social media in the aftermath of episode 6 and said that they were sickened by Daphne. They also attacked the showmakers for using such heavy themes as a plot device. But Bridgerton enthusiasts were quick to come to the show's defense. Fans justified Mrs. Hastings's actions by saying that it wasn't really her fault, and that she knew very little about sex or consent, and that's why she did what she did. Then there was this whole thing about how we can't apply 21st century rules to a period piece because society had different values back then. Others argued that Simon had manipulated her and had taken advantage of her innocence. He practically told her everything she knew about sex, so it was somehow his fault for not being fully honest. This wasn't even the craziest defense. Some even went as far as to say that what Daph did was empowering, and that women should be allowed to do evil things. There were actual articles online applauding the show for its complex portrayal of female heroines. Okay, so let's humor these arguments for a hot second. Even if we were to excuse Daphne on the basis of sheer ignorance, that doesn't justify hailing her as a feminist icon, does it? But the most insane thing is that the show tries to paint her as one. Even though Daphne Bridgerton never really challenged her oppression, her toxic relationship with her husband isn't the only reason why Daph makes for a terrible feminist. Even if we were to overlook that, Daphne is a classic example of a woman who's been fully brainwashed by the patriarchy. This is a female character who is overly dependent on the men around her. From the get-go, she relies on Anthony to find her a suitor, and later on, her husband to provide for her and also educate her about literally everything. Mrs. Hastings clearly doesn't understand what it means to be a strong, independent woman. Her entire purpose of existence is to follow the herd, find herself a suitor, and have his kids. The character's storyline literally revolves around a man. Who in their right mind would qualify this woman as a feminist? And before you come at me for not keeping in mind the context and the fact that women in that era had very limited choices, might I just remind you guys that Eloise was literally born in the same era and grew up under the very roof Daphne did. But Daphne's younger sister still defied the norms. She refused to get married or conform to ridiculous beauty standards. She even demanded a proper university education. So if you guys want to idolize someone for their feminism, Eloise is a better choice. Daphne's character only reproduces harmful stereotypes. By the end of season 1, Daphne comes off as a sad Meg Match wannabe. She's the showmaker's desperate attempt to create a unique brand of a feminist icon, but the sad truth is that her character is pretty damaging to the movement. For starters, Daphne Bridgerton is quite literally every creepy old man's fantasy. The actress they chose to play the role looks like an actual child. She's dainty and bird-like, to the point that some fans even went as far as to say that she looks about 12. And no, I'm not shaming Phoebe for her looks, but don't you guys think it's an interesting choice to have a thin, white-skinned, doll-like woman play a character who is portrayed as innocent, naive, and self-sacrificing? It's starting to sound a little like a male fantasy, isn't it? At the start of the season, when the character is introduced, her looks are given more importance than anything. This continues throughout the show. Daphne's main form of power is her beauty, time and time again. Imagine the message that this sends out to young girls watching. It teaches them to value their appearance more than anything else. That's exactly what our Little Miss Perfect does. She never once makes an attempt to educate herself, to pick up a book, heck, to even learn more about her own sexuality. Instead, she spends the entirety of the show chasing after a man. And so, from setting unrealistic standards of beauty and perfection to violating her husband's consent, this was the real reason Daphne Bridgerton is a shame to feminists.